Who do you think you are? Who do you think you are? It's a question we might bark at someone when they're rude to us at the grocery store, or when someone cuts you off on the highway. Hey, buddy, who do you think you are? I must admit that I've said it once or twice when one of my kids has talked back to me. Son, who do you think you are? But when asked as a serious question, it is perhaps one of the most profound and important questions for a human being. Who do you think you are? Who are you? Why are you here? What is your purpose in life? Where is your life going? Now, you can answer that question in a number of ways. You might tell me where you're from, what town or city you grew up in. You might describe what you're studying in school. For lots of people, our careers and professional achievements are central to our identities. For others of us, our race or gender or sexual orientation are the primary ways we identify ourselves. In certain university or academic settings, I might be expected to share that I'm a cisgender, heterosexual, non-Hispanic, white, and American Indian man. You might pull up the latest version of your Instagram or TikTok or Facebook. How many hours do some of us spend carefully curating our online identities, desperately trying to seem unique with the clothes we're wearing or the filters we use or the quotes we share to signal our cultural awareness and virtue, how woke we are? But if you and I were to go deeper, if we really wanted to know one another, we would need more than Instagram profiles and school transcripts. I want you to imagine for a minute that you finally work up the courage to ask that handsome guy or beautiful woman from Chi Alpha out for coffee. And you sit down at a small table for two in the back corner of Vivid, and he or she says to you, so, tell me about yourself. Who is fill in the blank? Chances are you would tell your date some stories. Sure, you might talk some about where you grew up, but to really know someone, you need to know their story. You need to know about their experiences, the challenges they faced, the obstacles they've overcome, their dreams for the future. Human beings, we're storytellers. We tell stories to make sense of our world. We tell stories to make sense of our lives. The big questions in life. Who am I? What is my purpose? What's wrong with our world? What makes for a meaningful life? We answer these questions by telling stories. Stories about our world that we believe are true. One author put it this way. He said, to be human means to embrace some basic story through which we understand our world and chart our course through it. We need a basic story to make sense of our world. In other words, we live out of our stories. If you believe that the universe was formed by chance and that life is a fleeting 70 or 80 years, if you're lucky, before you die and decompose in the dirt, and that one day the sun will go out and all of this will come to an end, if that's the story you believe, you will live quite differently than if you believe that there's a creator God who designed this world. That our fleeting 70 or 80 years on this planet is just a foretaste of an eternity spent with him. That one day we will be resurrected to live with that God in a new heaven and new earth, and that what we do now will have implications for the life we experience in that future. The stories we believe determine how we live. Tonight I want to look at one of my favorite stories from the Bible. It's about two followers of Jesus. And they've believed and have been living out of a certain story. And this story has shaped their lives, their decisions, their hopes, their dreams. But that story gets turned upside down by events beyond their control, and they're devastated until someone comes along and gives them a new story. If you have a Bible, please turn to the Gospel of Luke. Luke chapter 24, verses 13 to 32. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. But they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus." He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" Two of Jesus' disciples, a man named Cleopas and someone else, maybe his wife, they're walking from Jerusalem to the town of Emmaus a couple of days after Jesus' death and burial. Scholars believe that these two disciples must have been fairly close to Jesus' inner circle. After all, they were not only aware of the death and burial of Jesus, but on Easter Sunday, they had already heard about those first women who discovered Jesus' empty tomb. And they are just devastated. You see, the earliest followers of Jesus had certain assumptions, certain beliefs about who Jesus was and what he was about in this world. The story these disciples believed went something like this. God, the Creator God, he had chosen the people of Israel to be his own special covenant people. He had made promises to them that if they were faithful to him, he would give them a land, he would make them a nation, and he would dwell with them and be present with them. That they would be a blessing to all the nations. In fact, one day all nations would worship their God. But because Israel had been unfaithful to God, because of their sin and their idolatry, God had allowed other nations, first Assyria, then Babylon, Persia, and now Rome. These other nations took their land and ruled over them. But God had promised that one day he would send a Messiah, a new king, to set Israel free, to reestablish their sovereignty, to set their world to rights, to bring justice and peace. Jesus' earliest followers rightly believed that Jesus was this Messiah, but they believed he would defeat Rome with force and power to become their Jewish king. They banked everything on this belief. They spent 3 years following Jesus, learning from him, watching him perform mighty deeds of healing and deliverance. They were ready for him to lead them into battle, to overthrow Rome. But then it all came crashing down. Jesus was captured and executed by the chief priests of Israel and the Roman occupiers. It seemed that the Roman story, the story of power and conquest, had defeated the story of God's covenant with Israel. And so what do they do now? What are they supposed to believe? Where do they put their hope? What story will make sense of their world now? Even though we are living 2,000 years later in a different nation and a different culture, I think we can understand the disciples' confusion and despair. We're living in a time when many of our culture's stories have collapsed. After the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, the most pervasive cultural story in the West was that science and reason would save us, that we would continually improve our world until we achieve peace and prosperity. That story has been dashed by a century of war, genocides, Hiroshima, the continuing presence of white supremacy and violence in our nation, climate change. Are things really getting better? Many in our world buy into the consumerist story that meaning in life is found in the stuff we have, that if we can work hard and afford to buy the right clothes, the right house, the right car, the right toys, then we'll be happy. But many of us work and strive for years only to discover that it comes up short, that all that stuff in the world doesn't satisfy our soul's deepest longings. Some of us have ascribed to a version of the Christian story that as we've gotten older doesn't seem to measure up anymore. Maybe the story goes something like this. You're bad and God's mad and you better believe in Jesus if you want to go to heaven. But that story fails to make sense of so much of our lives. If the Christian story is just about having our sins forgiven and going to heaven when we die, what about our studies and our hobbies and our families? What about work and food and sex and entertainment? Sometimes things happen in our lives that cause our stories to collapse. Maybe it's the death of a grandparent, or our parents getting divorced, or the end of a long-term dating relationship. There are times when the stories we've used to make sense of our lives and of our world, they no longer work for us. Many of you know that I was raised in a kind of a nominal Christian home, but by the time I graduated from high school and went off to college, faith and God were some of the last things on my mind. I attended college at the New England Conservatory of Music. I was a clarinet performance major, and I attended NEC because I believed it would give me the best shot of achieving my dreams of one day playing in a major symphony orchestra. The story I lived in when I got to NEC went something like this. My value as a person was determined by my success as a musician. My worth was rooted in my achievements. That was my story. And so I was driven to be the best clarinetist at the school. And at times I was. I would practice and rehearse sometimes 10 hours a day. I had no social life. I rarely hung out with friends. And not only did I not make time for friends, but I saw people around me primarily as competition. Life was a zero-sum game. If others succeeded, that diminished my own self-worth. Everything needed to take a back seat to my musical ambitions. Everything. And that was the story I lived in. But as you might imagine, that story soon began to fall apart. I found myself becoming more and more lonely and depressed. And as I looked around me and looked at the lives of my classmates and teachers, people who had achieved all of my dreams, I saw just how unhappy so many of them were. I saw their bitterness and their brokenness. I began to see that the music story, the achievement story, the professional success story, it wasn't enough. I needed a new story to make sense of my life. I needed a new story that was worthy of my life. That's where Cleopas and this other disciple are. And then the risen Jesus, not recognized by these two, he comes alongside of them. And what does he do? Jesus doesn't lecture them in apologetics. He doesn't give them philosophical proofs about why the resurrection from the dead is possible. Instead, Jesus walks them through the story, the biblical story. He tells them what in one sense was a very familiar story, but he reframes it. He gives it new clarity. He opens their eyes to what the point of the story was all along. He helps them to see that the entire story, from the very beginning, had pointed to this very moment, to him, to his life, to his death and resurrection. That all they had hoped for and longed for, it had come true in him. He was the king they had been waiting for. He had in fact defeated the enemy. But the true enemy wasn't Rome. It was sin and death. God's kingdom had won. The kingdom of heaven had broken through. The biblical story, when truly understood, really was the true story of the world. And as Jesus walks them through the biblical story, the disciples say their hearts burn within them. There was a spark inside. Something inside of them came alive. They knew it was true. It was good. It was beautiful. It was the story that made sense of everything. James Smith, in his book, The Magnificent Story, he writes, "We are creatures with a mystery in our heart that is bigger than ourselves. We may think we can find ultimate pleasure, satisfaction, and meaning in sex, money, or power. But in reality, those have never satisfied anyone. They are too small for our massive souls. We were designed to take part in a divine drama, an epic story." When I was in college going through my crisis of meaning and faith, it turned out that some of the few friends I had at NEC, they were Christians and they were involved in Chi Alpha. They began to pursue me, to reach out to me, to invite me to Bible studies and movie nights and dinner. They showed me faithful and persistent love, even when I consistently said no and turned them down. But I could tell they didn't live by the same story as me. They were living by different rules. They had a freedom in their lives. They had joy. They weren't controlled by their ambition. They were living for something or someone other than themselves. And I began to want what they had. It took 2 years, but finally I relented and handed over my life to Jesus. You see, Jesus offered me a new story that made sense of life, that resonated with the deepest parts of my heart. And it was something like this. No matter how well or poorly I performed on stage or in life, my worth and value had already been determined by the God of the universe. I had a freedom to fail in the world's eyes because God's opinion was what mattered most, and that was already determined. This new story said that God had plans for me that mattered way more than any professional success. I discovered that the main character in God's story wasn't me. The main character was this beautiful, provocative, wise, and good man named Jesus. He was the star. He was the hero. And I fell in love with him. I wanted to know him. I wanted to be like him. And more than anything else, I wanted to fulfill the small role God had written for me. I wanted to be a part of his story. I wanted to be a part of this epic drama where he rescues and redeems a good but broken world, where he undoes all the ways we've destroyed his creation, where he brings peace and reconciliation to people, where he sets captives and slaves free. I had finally found a story worthy of my life. I want to invite you on this journey with us this semester. We are going to take the next 8 weeks of our semester to discover or rediscover the biblical story. For many of us, when we think of the Bible, we think of it as a series of really ancient, isolated tales that make very little sense, but somehow they're supposed to teach us about how to live holy, but also maybe a bit boring lives. These tales have very little to do with one another, and on any given day we can simply open our Bible, randomly stick our finger on a page, and begin to read. We have no sense of how all these stories fit together to form a story, a narrative, an epic story of a creator God who loves the world he made and goes to extraordinary lengths to rescue it from evil and death. So this semester, we're going to take a step back and talk about the bigger story of the Bible. And we're going to ask if this bigger story, this meta-narrative, if it can make sense of our world, give meaning to our lives, and answer the deepest cries of our hearts. All of our life groups, we're going to be following along and studying this story. Each week we'll also be posting a reading plan so that you can read along in the Bible on your own. And we'll have devotional exercises and playlists to help you pray and worship through God's story. But we're going to keep asking the question, what if our Christian faith isn't just something we add on to our lives, like a good exercise routine or healthy eating in order to improve ourselves and make our lives a bit happier? What if being a Christian isn't just about believing the right things or saying a certain prayer or not doing certain things or going to church, as important as all those things are? What if being a Christian is more about discovering that we're part of a larger story, God's story, and this world He created, it's going somewhere, that we are made for a purpose, and only when we understand His story, only when we begin living out our part in that story as an apprentice of King Jesus will we discover what we're made for. What might happen if the biblical story becomes the defining narrative of our lives? Is it possible that this story could change everything? Maybe you're new to Christianity and just exploring what it means to follow Jesus, and you're curious about whether or not it's real, and real in a way that goes far deeper than facts or philosophy or scientific proofs, real in a way that grips your heart and makes sense of the world in only the way that a good story can, real in a way that's good and beautiful and true. Maybe like me in college, you're finding that the story you've based your life on up to this point is just not working anymore. Maybe you've grown up in a Christian family or going to church and you've heard bits and pieces of the Christian story. You know the important doctrines that you're supposed to believe, but you're not quite sure how it all fits together. You believe in Jesus, you believe that He died for you, you believe in eternal life, but what about now? What about your classes? What about that party you went to on Friday night? What about dating and sex and caring for the environment and racial justice and politics? What does this Jesus have to do with all of that? Maybe this has been a hard season of life for you. Like me, maybe you've lost a loved one to COVID. Maybe you've watched your parents walk away from their marriage. Maybe you're struggling with anxiety or depression and you're wondering, where is God in all of this? What does Jesus have to do with the pain I'm feeling right now? What if there's a story that makes sense of it all? What if there's a story that not only accurately describes the way our world is, but also what the deepest parts of our hearts long for the world to become? What if there's a story that, rather than helping us to escape this life, gives us the strength and courage to live life, that brings meaning to life right now? I'm convinced that the biblical story does just that. That's a story worthy of our lives. So who do you think you are? Who do you think you are? What's your story? What's the story you're living out of? Is it working? Is this story worthy of your life?